Okay, good people. We are officially live and direct. This is AFRO-LIT 101, the first session. I thank you guys for tuning in. This is episode 1, and we're going to just go over a ton of, what I've been able to accumulate as basically a dialogue with my community about, the similarities and differences that we may find amongst the diaspora of African Americans and or African people of specifically South Africa, but Africa as abroad. Like I've had more of a, ingrained experience with those of South Africa, Ingepume Peshe, Dolobine Klani in New Orleans, but Ingishlala, Nete Amayakanane. I moved here primarily because of Makote Wami, and she is Amazulu, so it's a Bongo Sake, Njomani, Mshlongo Bebe, and me, myself, I am Mr. Responsible, and I'm here to just kind of give you kind of the instructor role in terms of this AFRO-LIT 101, and we're basically going to just be reverse engineering African literature, and we're going to start off with this first episode about Ubuntu Magic, the Pledge, Turn, and Prestige. So yeah, just make sure you guys just tap in if you are on TikTok to be able to see the screen that you will be able to basically experience the full experience. You will have to basically join us on YouTube, which is at Responsible. So yes, you guys are welcome to come in on that angle. Let me see and make sure everything is going live. Looks like we are. So shouldn't be any issues. Yep. Looks like we are live in every aspect. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. So we're talking about today is AFRO-LIT 101. It's going to be the Ubuntu Magic, the Pledge, the Turn, and Prestige. So in this Afro literature, breakdown, it's more so centered around my experience as an African American that's originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, and over time, I've, just accumulated, I guess, the willpower and just the faith that I can now explore beyond the realms of America. And that's brought me to South Africa specifically. And while I've been here, I've been exploring and unlearning a lot and learning more about just the context of Africa versus what I was, originally having as an African American that just sees Africa as this concept, and as this like big thing that's a part of our history as African Americans, but nothing that you really truly know in depth. So I was able to basically take that time of my life to be able to travel to South Africa and be able to live there. And I've traveled amongst other areas in Africa as well, including Egypt primarily, but mostly around South Africa is where I got a lot of my cultural and long-term experience. And this is something where I document basically my unlearning and my transformation basically from one aspect of being just an African American with a concept of Africa versus, actually going to live in Africa and being able to, see and unlearn a lot of the things that were taught, from a, I guess, outside looking in type of perspective. So this is kind of like the framework that we're going to be breaking it down is this Ubuntu Magic, the Pledge, Turn, and Prestige. And Ubuntu is, we'll get more into the details of what that is. But if you guys are tuning in on YouTube or TikTok, just make sure you show some engagement and we'll continue to keep it pushing. I'm trying to pull up my TikTok chat here, see if we have anybody in the chat. Okay, nothing as of yet, but we do have some people on the tubular. But yeah, let's get it started. So, yes, so this is AFRO-LIT 101, episode 1. And just to kind of further break down what the Pledge, the Turn, and Prestige is, I kind of want to give some insight. This is based off of one of my favorite movies. It's called The Prestige, and it's a Christopher Nolan film. You may know Christopher Nolan from The Odyssey. He's also a part of the Batman series, The Dark Knight, The Batman Begins, Dark Knight Rises. And these are some of his most influential movies. But The Prestige is one of his hidden, like in the cut joints that I really took a liking to. And what he kind of presents in this movie is basically like the concept and the formula behind magic tricks. And it's basically a movie where you have Christian Bale playing a magician, and then you also have Hugh Jackman playing a magician. And these are characters, Christian Bale, you may know him from Batman, Dark Knight. And Hugh Jackman, he's a player that plays Wolverine. And that's another thing about this African literature situation. I'm about to go on a like quick tangent before we get into what, the Prestige is all about. But I do understand that these actors like that play Batman and play Wolverine and in the Marvel universe and in the DC universe, a lot of the literature where, these are the things that kind of get the glorification and being able to be a constant remnants of a story in our lives. Like we always see Spider-Man story, we always see Batman story, we always see the X-Men story, but these are not necessarily African stories, but they kind of, play off the concepts of a lot of African resilience, African, exchange. And this is something that, as the newer artists that come around, you have the Michael B. Jordans and the Ryan Cooglers, the way that they kind of get into the industry is by adapting basically these African movies. Like Black Panther was a big movie that, Ryan Coogler was able to adopt, and that gave him the aspect to be able to get into the industry and make a platform to be able to get to the levels of being able to produce his own concept of Sinners. And Michael B. Jordan also, like a lot of times before they are able to create their own content, they got to kind of rehash some stuff that is originally American or, of European writing versus really having African literature, African-American literature be at the forefront. So this is something that I kind of see, and I kind of want to take back that narrative and just show the importance of African literature. And this AFRO-LIT 101 is basically our attempt to do that. So what we're going to be talking about today is the first article. Is called Ubuntu Magic, and it's based upon the pledge to turn in prestige. So I'm just explaining that the pledge turn in prestige is the concepts, it's the formula behind the magic trick. So in the pledge is when you basically, a magician will first present a person, thing, or place in its normally perceived format. And during this initial display, the presenter already has an idea of how they will manipulate the perception of the observer based on their study of how belief works. So an example of what we're going to be talking about here is really about the African-American and African, originality that they kind of possess. But when it's pledged to them, like the version of African that African-Americans are introduced to is that it's something that you want to be civilized from. And that it's something that, you are better off being an American versus being, an African. And that's kind of like what is presented to us, but in the aspect of that, a lot of people like rebel against that. And then when they get into the concept of studying Africa, it kind of comes from a fanatical type of viewpoint to where Black Panther is the reference points or Egypt, and it's not really based in the modern reality. And from my experience, I'm able to immerse myself in the culture in South Africa and kind of get a real true essence of, the culture here and the customs. And that's kind of like what I kind of just see as what is happening in terms of what a lot of people aren't able to experience. So if they aren't able to experience, they stick with what is the original pledge to them, that this African background that we may have is something that you need to be civilized from. And this is kind of like what is a part of the magic trick, because the concept of the pledge to turn in prestige of the magic trick is when you present something and then you make it disappear and then you make it come back. And that's like the full formula of the magic trick. So the pledge is when you present something to somebody, the turn is when you make it disappear, and the prestige is when you're able to bring it back. And it's all a play on the narrative. There is no actual magic. And that's what they kind of show in the movie, The Prestige, is that this is something that is basically you're playing on the perception of people. And this is kind of like my argument against, what African Americans are going through, is that when they're presented themselves as African, it's more of trying to make you forget about your African, like make you disassociate with it. And that's the turn. Like they want to show that the narrative of you being African is something that you want to disassociate with versus something that you should embrace. But the actual magic is that combats this magic. Like there's the magic that people are trying to erase and give you some level of amnesia of your history. But then the prestige comes about when, in the aspect of all of that, we still maintain some level of resilience and attachment to our African culture as African Americans. And it's really through that Ubuntu principle that I feel like is, engraved in the Black man, no matter where, you may be. So even if it is washed away in terms of, you don't have your ancestral relics and you don't have all the stuff that may remind you of who you are if you were on your ancestral land, what you do have is basically something that you're born with, which is that hospitality, that humanization that we kind of practice and that you can find in the Southern hospitality of America. But also what I've been able to experience in South Africa is a certain level of hospitality that I would, that I've learned is a really principle of the Ubuntu spirit. So this is kind of like the concept. And if you are on TikTok watching this, you can go to YouTube and Responsible to kind of see the presentation. I'm limited to only putting the presentation on my YouTube channel as of now. But in the coming weeks, we will be able to put more, layers and be able to add the screen to the TikTok. But if you want to see the full presentation, you can join us on YouTube for the full presentation. So, yes, this is what we're going to be breaking down in this first article, which is called Ubuntu Magic, the Pledge to Turn in Prestige. And yeah, it's really based around this amnesia of Africa. So this is the pledge, and I kind of start off my articles and my essays with a poem. So I'm going to just recite the poem for those on TikTok, and then on YouTube, you guys can kind of see, the presentation that we have along with this, video stream. So this is a poem that's based upon the Pledge of Allegiance, which we recite in America. We taught this as children, and this is something that we learn to, just kind of pledge our allegiance to the country. It's like a nationalism aspect, but I kind of made a flip of it on this this poem that I'm going to present to you guys. And it's based around, it's going to like set the tone for the whole article that we're going to be reading. Well, we're only going to get into one part of the article for tonight, and we're going to break it down further on Wednesday and Friday. But for today, I'm just going to give you the first part, which is the pledge. So, I pledge allegiance to the wrath of the United States of America and to the corrupted, for which demands all nations under bombs, till invisible, with energy and subjects for war. So, like I'm telling you, this is a remix of the original Pledge of Allegiance. It goes a little bit differently, but my pledge is of a grievance to the wrath of the United States of America for what they've done in the corruption and the demand that all nations are under bombs until invisible with energy and subjects for war. So it's a kind of a flip on what you may get, when you are pledging allegiance. It's more of I'm associating with the grievances that we may have as the African American community. And now we go further into our first passage where we will just show, the reverse engineering of this is what we are actually trying to get behind. And as I read these sentences, you're going to be able to see where I'm rooting this information from as I go into, the process of showing how all of this is researched back from my community and from the conversations and the dialogues that I've been having with those on Instagram, on TikTok. And that's kind of like what I want to continue to build is basically, I don't want my articles to only be, a one-sided viewpoint. I want to kind of enjoy the dialogue and the conversation, because this is more of a conversation than me educating about anything, because I'm still learning myself. But in the midst of this, I can offer like basically a research repository is what I want my page of Mr. Responsible Associates to become. So when people want to learn about South Africa, want to learn about Africa, want to learn about even New Orleans, America, where I'm from, they can kind of go to this and look through the comments and look through everything and kind of get an aspect of, the connections or the disconnections that we may have. So I'm going to like show, the blueprint of how I create these articles and the formula behind that. And hopefully it can give you some insight to if you want to have some level of creative expression yourself, you can learn how to base it in research and how to perform this research. So we're just going to start off with this first passage, and you guys can, again, tag along in YouTube if you would like to read more. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, first passage. Admiration often leaves blind spots when fanatically studying African history in hindsight versus experiencing immersion into the modern reality of African countries. For late 20th and early 21st century African Americans in particular, the lure of mentally returning to a time before the transatlantic slave trade commenced becomes essential due to the persistently reinforced levels of mistreatment that have occurred during and after our expulsion from the ancestral land. Excuse me. So basically in these first two sentences, we are just talking about how I mentioned, we as African Americans have a certain admiration for Africa sometimes when we are rebelling against the image that they kind of give us as, oh, you come from slavery, we had to civilize you in America, you come from a savage lifestyle, and it's better off for you to just go into the American path fully. Some people, go to the path of rebelling against that viewpoint and actually want to, just kind of learn more about the African background that you may have. But our admiration for it kind of leaves blind spots to the reality when it's like a fanatical look at the history. And it's more of, this is what people, when they, theorize about the diasporic connections and like they study maybe Marcus Garvey or they study Malcolm X and they hear these, back to Africa type of movements and these Pan-African movements. It's all based out of a theory, but not based in reality. And me, in Ishlala and Etekwene Manje Amayaka Nane, I've been here for 4 years, and I've been able to like have a real life experience. Like I've been able to work, in Gilashle Umsebenzawame recently, but before that I was working in tech for a good amount of time, and I was making a little bit of money, and I was able to just experience both sides of being able to just live on, I guess, the good and bad sides of just, you know, what you may experience, and not just all living in theory. Like, and I've also been able to connect with a lot of people in South Africa, and it's just given me a broader perspective of, you know, what I may have had before I moved to South Africa, which was more of a outside and just studying it from the novels or from books or from, you know, movies and from other readings. But just going forward, what this journey kind of allows for you to do is, you know, you are wanting to basically get a feel for something that will distract you from the harsh realities that you may be living as an African American, and the studies of something that, you know, is beyond that. Is kind of like what is the lure of returning to something that was before the transatlantic slave trade. So going forward, grasping an understanding of how alternative trajectories may have panned out without this cataclysmic disruption serves as a temporary solvent by momentarily disassociating from the harsh abuse that has plagued our actual becoming, and recovering from the resulting amnesia has been mainly blockaded by the uprooting that distances us from the vital reminders existing in the respective homeland. So this is like going back to the aspect of how when we are in America and we're like separated from our homeland, there is a level of disassociation from the relics that will remind you. If you are in your homeland, it's kind of hard for you to get amnesia of your real self and what you truly are, versus when you're in America, there aren't any really reminders. Well, my experience was a little bit different because I grew up in New Orleans, and we're like, you know, a port city. So when the slave trade was going on, like a lot of the slaves would come through New Orleans. And in that aspect, a lot of, you know, the culture was still relevant and still practiced. So in that aspect, you know, in New Orleans, we still kind of have some revival of our African lineage. But throughout majority of America, a lot of people don't have any of those relics that will remind you of who you truly are. So you kind of can have that amnesia, versus if you are in Africa and you are not living like, you know, what you culturally are supposed to be, then somebody's going to remind you, somebody's going to tell you like who you really are. So it's hard for you to get amnesia of who you really are if you are on the soil that you are originally from. So this is what we're exploring in this basically topic here, is basically how when you are in a place where that you have lost those relics, it's kind of easy for you to kind of get this amnesia of who you actually are. And that's what African Americans are experiencing in a sense. So, and more layers of defense, you know, persist through the adoption of the English language and Western education that effectively decontextualize foreign concepts from individual reception and collective recognition. So this is the first passage of our article, Ubuntu Magic, the Pledge, Turn, and Prestige. And you guys, again, if you are viewing on TikTok, you can kind of come in on YouTube, be able to see the full presentation that is going to show you the article, or you could read along with the article on my Substack, mrresponsible.substack.com. And this will allow for you to better like follow along what we have going on here. So, yeah, just moving forward, I'm going to utilize this first passage, which basically breaks down the pledge of what African Americans are presented as their African background, and how, you know, we kind of have an association and want to learn about our African, you know, background, but also it's kind of, it starts to be something that is fanatically looked at versus something that is based in reality. And what we're going to go through here is basically how this concept came about. Like, again, I said, a lot of what I'm writing in these articles are fed from, you know, the research that I've done by posting reels on my TikTok, posting reels on my Instagram, and seeing the comments and being able to dialogue with people and being able to build some level of research base to be able to make sure that my article is based in not only my opinion, but something that I can basically validate through the people that I'm going to be giving these articles to. And that's what my whole concept of what this Afro-Literature 101 is about teaching how to base your creativity in research, so that if you have your own creative expression, you can kind of practice that aspect of making sure that you have somebody that is willing to basically see what you're doing is valuable, versus just hoping and wishing that, you know, as artists, we kind of just put our stuff out there without any guarantee of a return. And that's what kind of leads into the level of like a starving artist type of aspect, because you are just hoping on a wish that, you know, your creativity would be explored. But when you base your stuff in research and you talk to people and you make sure that your stuff is valuable before you actually go into creating your art, it kind of helps you. So these are the tools that we kind of break down and what we're going to be breaking down on the further channels. But the first tool that I want to break down that helped me write that first article is something called a journey map. And a journey map, it serves as an organizational tool to help outline an expressive offering and recognize the phases that you want your audience to experience and what insights will guide your connection. So this is kind of like what the journey map is meant for. It's something that will help you organize basically your thoughts and the research that you get and put it in phases so that when somebody is experiencing your full article or your full piece of artwork or your music, that you can break it down into sections and you can have connection points that you know somebody may connect with. They may connect in phase 1, they may connect in phase 2, and you break it down along this journey map. And this is something that is a very powerful tool in terms of, once you get your research from talking and interviewing people and doing your dialogue side of the work, you can kind of now turn that into an actual, research repository that you can always go back to and be able to act as a tool for you to be able to really foundate your article writing. That's what I particularly do it in facts and in people's opinion that will be shared once you are giving out this article. So you can see here we have basically 5 sections that we're going to be breaking down. And today we're going to primarily go over the pledge and the practices. But there's other phases that we will go along on the following days of Wednesday and Thursday, where we'll be continuing in the AFRO-LIT class with Mr. Responsible, which is myself. So just to go further into the pledge, you can see that we kind of have a breakdown of the comments that we was able to extract from the reels that we was doing on Instagram and on TikTok. And you can see some of these things are basically like a collection of the different thoughts, and you kind of gather them into the ones that are similar, the ones that are not similar, and that's the way that you organize these tools. It's basically you go into the aspect of finding the comments, you sift through all the comments, and then you kind of see which ones are similar, which ones are voicing a certain type of opinion. And like from my reels that I was posting, it was more so trying to understand the disconnection or the connection between African Americans and those that are those that are that speak Bantu and Nguni languages. So the Southern African, side of Africa and the African American connection. And a lot of people had some agreement that they may have some, routes of this transatlantic slave trade to where they may have, some Southern Africans that also similar to African Americans. But majority of people were on the side of, African Americans are actually originating from West Africa, and we don't have as much Southern African roots. But they had a lot of different dialogue that was taking place, and in the research that I'm able to do, I'm able to look at all of the comments and put it in one place that I can kind of cipher through and be able to build my perspective off of that. So the first thing that we have for the pledge, we was able to build a group of insights labeled diasporic connection, and we have comments from different people that were in the TikTok comments, and this is something that I want y'all to encourage y'all to continue to do, is to engage, because it can help us, build an article that is founded in your voice as well. And I can, act as a voice for you until you are also, going through the method of being able to base your own creations and research. So this is what the main aspect of what we want to put in our basically journey map is. When we are talking about the pledge phase, we want to see what we want our audience to be doing, what we want them to be feeling, and what we want them to be thinking. And this is what, we are trying to basically help them experience in terms of our article is, taking insights from the research, from the comments, and now putting it in our journey map to kind of, really bring a full connection point to when we want to display this pledge phase that is based in what we was able to gather from those that we was able to dialogue and converse with. So some of the main things that we see that we are doing in the pledge phase, which again is a part of, the 3 parts of a magic trick, is basically the pledge when you present the original version of what something is. The turn is when you make it disappear, and then the prestige is when you bring it back. So we're trying to go into the pledge phase, and we're going to depict what people are basically dialoguing with me about, when we are in our original version as African Americans, when we were, before this transatlantic slave trade, what were we primarily? And what we were doing is basically, we was once a big village that had laws, taboos, and many other ways of life, which caused some to chart their own paths but never change what they were taught by their elders. So this is something that I was able to gather from my the research of the comments, and then also people were feeling content in, the aspect of living without the disruption of colonialism or imperialism or the slave trade. And some of the things that we were thinking is based on the areas that they were settled in and how big the civilization they built became attracted outsiders and changed their language and phenotypes. Others became isolated and lost their abilities to click their language, and others got absorbed by other bigger groups. And there are 3 primarily founding peoples of Southern Africa. So these are some of the insights that I was able to gather, which helps me understand, what is the pledge, what is the original African before African American. And that's kind of like what's going to build my next next part of the article, the second passage. But I just want to give you an insight of how this harmony map, this is what this is called when we gather all of the information from the comments, and it's kind of organized into this map that we're able to label things. You're able to see like what is the religious similarities between Africans and African Americans, kind of a category that's speaking more about the Nguni and Bantu language. Some people agreeing that there's a diasporic connection, some people saying that there's no cultural connection. And then this is all sourced from, the TikTok and the Facebook pages that allow us to basically gather more information. So just to give you guys a look into that on YouTube, you can kind of zoom in a little bit. But I'm going to move forward now to the second passage so we can get, where we are trying to get to. And this is kind of based upon what I was taught from my comments about, how, some people was telling me about this Nguni and Bantu labeling and how this isn't an accurate label of what, Southern African people actually, would call themselves. This is like an outsider's look of, what people labeled you as. And this is kind of the comments that they was giving me. They was saying, firstly, there is no such thing as an Nguni. There are 3 primary founding peoples of Southern Africa. That's where Botswana, Soto, Xhosa, Zulu, Shlubi, Songa, Pedi, Ndebele, and come from. So they're telling me that they aren't any Nguni, there's no such thing as an Nguni people. There are 3 primary founding peoples, and they are of Southern Africa, and that's where these different cultures come from. And then based on the areas that they settled in and how big the civilization they built became, attracted outsiders and changed their language and phenotypes. Others became isolated and lost their abilities to click their sounds, and others got absorbed by other bigger groups. There is no Nguni. Xhosa as a language is as close in structure and words etymologically as it is to Swati, like Mandala, Matla. So these are definitely some good insights that I was able to craft this next part of the article on. So we're going to read the second passage, which is kind of going to break down how I took that information that I was getting insight from my comments and be able to pull it into what I have here in my second passage. So I'm reading along, and if you guys would like to read along again, you can go to the YouTube at Mr. Responsible, and you can kind of see, or you can join the Substack, which you will see a link in my reels. You can kind of get to the links to where you can read along. Maybe I should put a link in the comments on my, I don't know if I can, but let me just get through the second passage and I'll see if I can do that for you guys. So, literary and audio channels serve as surface levels mediums of interpreting our history, but the internal barriers are seldom broken through without the reverberating information being filtered and compressed by a deconstructive imagination. So this is a real key of what we brought off we stopped in the last passage, and we mentioned that, the Western education in the English language is something that helps, us. It kind of distorts the information that we're able to gather. And I further along say that, the literary and audio channels that we are, gathering the information about Africa about it serves as a surface level medium of interpreting the history of Africa, but the internal barriers of our minds are seldom broken through without the reverberating information being filtered and compressed by a deconstructive imagination. So I call the imagination deconstructive because in America, we're kind of taught to build things in an analytical framework and compartmentalizing things to help us better understand things in a business sense. You want to be able to take some information, maybe of a big, large data pool, and be able to compartmentalize it to the best way for you to understand things. But in that aspect, it kind of loses the truth and the accurate descriptions of what something might be. And I feel like that is something that was perpetuated further through when there was outside encounters of Africa, and then those outside encounters of what is brought into the Western education canon that we kind of learn as the youth of, America. So just further along, the subjectivism practiced by analytically compartmentalizing sub-Saharan lifestyles forces the abandonment of empathetic reasoning and creating a skewed narrative of otherwise customary standards of living. For instance, the categorization of an ethnic group by the language they speak may be a sound approach for studious anthropologists, but the outcomes published can also be used by imperialists to misconstrue a multitude of close-knit kingdoms as one body of Nguni or Bantu people. So we can see again how I directly, referenced the notes that I was able to get from my comments and reels and put it in this article, and it's in the phase that I want the listener or whoever's going to be reading the article to kind of experience this information. So this is what the tools allow for you to do. It allows for you to structure your art, whether it's articles as I'm writing or music, where you want to just make sure that what you are giving and offering has a journey that the person is going through and is based upon the people that may be supporting your stuff, so you can be a voice for them. And they're more likely to basically support your artwork because they know that you are voicing their opinion or you're, doing something that's valuable for them. But more along to what I'm talking about in this article is basically how, once we are doing that situation of subjecting, outside entities as, we're trying to analyze and decompartmentalize these situations of understanding of people that we may not know personally. We're kind of getting it through the lens of those that, encountered Africans and wanted to kind of just put them all together into a group so they could better understand it. And this is how kind of the Nguni or Bantu people labels came about, because during certain clashes between the colonizers and the indigenous people of Southern Africa, they kind of recognized that the people that they are basically fighting against, in terms of the colonizers, are fighting against the people that are already there, and they aren't seeing it as the separate chiefdoms and kingdoms that they may actually be. They're seeing it as just one people that they are just going to call the Bantu people or the Nguni people, and that is something that disregards basically any type of understandings that may be within the people that are already probably have an understanding of who each other are, but these outsiders come in and then they distort the reality, and they further perpetuate that distortion when they put it in the education that we may have in America. So going forward, mature coalitions of civil alliance. And if you are enjoying what we're talking about here, just make sure you show some love in the chat, just share it to those that may be interested in this type of information. If you are gaining some insight to what African Americans are going through, and if this is helping you understand a little bit more. So mature coalitions of civil alliance formed over the pre-colonial time period were forced to acquiesce to this false linguistic constructs in order to defend against the colonizers' explorative conquest, and protective measures to strengthen numbers caused what may have been equal societies to adopt a hierarchy that positioned clans with advanced warrior classes at the forefront in order to survive the incoming invasions. So we're just talking about now further how these mature coalitions that may have taken place before the pre-colonial time period, they were kind of forced to acquiesce to these false linguistic constructs, because you have to kind of ally with those that are in close proximity to you to fight against this opposing force. And now, because you are defending against, this colonizer's explorative conquest, the people that may have more of a stronger warrior class, such as the Shaka Zulus of the world, is kind of absorbing the cultures that aren't really ready for that type of action. And in terms of that, that's how, the hierarchies kind of come about, in terms of Zulu people kind of having a lot of, worldwide renownty, because in the documentation of what is happening is coming from, the colonizer's viewpoint, and they kind of had more of a battle with the Zulus. And this is from my understanding. This isn't like, I have to do more studies about, the clashes between the colonizers and the indigenous people of Southern Africa. But in terms of what I understand, the outsiders were basically just putting them into a collective, and then based upon the language speaking, and then the people that work in proximity to each other had to kind of, form under that, proximity to those that knew their language to be able to fight against this bigger force that was coming in. And because of this bigger force coming in, the people that were more keen to fighting against that were the people that was able to get kind of a stance that was probably more, I guess, on the front lines, I guess, in terms of leadership of these people that probably had some association as equal standings at one point between the Xhosa, the Venda, the Shlubi, and the Zulu people. Like they probably had some understanding of their alliance and, how they can civilly work together. But when they had this opposing force come about, they kind of had to go under the realm, under the influence of the people that was more advanced in terms of the warrior spirit, in which comes about as in the Zulu practice under the leadership of Shaka Zulu. So furthering our understanding of, this journey map, we're basically just showing how, something that can come about as original for Africans that are in Africa. They may have a deeper understanding, but as African Americans, when we're learning about this history, we're starting to get a level of distortion. And this is what separates us from, the understanding of Africa as a whole, is because our understanding is coming from this pledge that was presented, but now it's being distorted by this magician, I would like to call it, because this is what the framework of what we're talking about here is Ubuntu magic. Ubuntu magic is basically like what's combating the magician's aspect of giving African Americans amnesia of Africa. And in the amnesia aspect, this is how they do it. They distort the narrative. So we start to get into the level of how they turn from the pledge. So basically, like they present to you a version of yourself as an African, but then they distort the reality and the narrative in your mind of what these people actually are and what you actually are, to where you want to kind of adopt more of where you are now versus associating with the previous. And that is what the goal of the amnesia of Africa kind of is. And in this explaining, I'm trying to just show the process of this and how African Americans come to a position to where they kind of lose that understanding of their true African self. But further along, we're going to start to go into how the pets, from Africa to America kind of started to also distort and shape different narratives amongst those that are in African American currently. And how a lot of the gathering that I was able to get from those that was sharing comments with me in a dialogue was saying that there's not a cultural connection between the Southern African people and of African Americans. And this is kind of just me highlighting the fact that there is a big confusion aspect. Like the people in Africa that I've dialogued with, especially in Southern Africa, feel like they may not have as much of a cultural connection with African Americans, and some people do. And that just shows how the pathways are so convoluted to where nobody really knows the accuracy of how African Americans are and how they have, become what they are today. But nobody can really truly say that if they are West African, East African, because there's so much migration that is going on in the transatlantic slave trading, and even just the trading that happened before the transatlantic slave trade, which is like the Arabian slave trade, which forced some people to move from the northern areas down to the southern areas, and just more of just migration, even if it wasn't from slave trade, just from, maybe agricultural situations that they had to kind of adapt to. So all of this movement, there isn't a clear aspect of, what is the true identity of African Americans. So that is something that we are also just trying to highlight here as we go into our third passage, which is going to explore basically that concept. So just following up on what we last went over in the second passage, we're talking about how, from the battles that have taken place in terms of the indigenous people of Southern Africa and the colonizers, what takes place is basically like a furthering of the colonizers' viewpoint when they get into basically recording the history and turning that into the Western education that we adopt as African Americans. So this is what we're going to talk about in the third passage. So naturally, the battles that have been recorded in history by the claimed victor perpetuate the mislabeling further and cements its documentation in the canon of Western education. As the indoctrination of displaced children is exercised in certain curriculums and further enhanced by exaggerated media portrayal, we grow accustomed to the distorted representation as verifiable fact. So this is like just breaking down the fact that when somebody in Africa, and an African American sees something like Black Panther, and this is something that we may take as actual fact of what Africa is, because this is what the concepts that we're trying to get when we're trying to study these things, and the fanatical aspect that we may have of Africa, if we are rebelling against the demonization of Africa, then we also are like on either on one side of the spectrum where we are also just trying to disassociate fully, or we are having a fantasy type of version of Africa, which is never in the middle of where Africa truly really is and really understanding, what's going on. And so this is, how the indoctrination and the conquerors of, the colonizers in the aspect are able to basically continue to distort the reality of what you truly are as an African American, which I believe is, of African lineage. And um, the basically idea that you are going to basically be able to tap in with your truth is only coming through exaggerated media portrayals and the Western viewpoint of what happened in these stories or these battles, like the battles that may taken place against, the Europeans and the indigenous Africans are recorded by the Europeans, and then that concept of whatever they want to say as the victor is kind of what is canonized in the Western education. So, exposure to the unbiased truth can best be discovered through engagement with trusted sources occupying the associated grounds, which could be accessed solely through overseas travel until social media discourse became an efficient way to gather reliable references. But even then, the former method will be preferred due to the mixed signals you may receive from the saturated pool of information available online today. As a practitioner of both forms of research, I've expanded my capacity to identify hidden nuances that broaden my understanding into an objective framework. And that's what the goal of what we have going on here is all about. It's about not necessarily being, subjective, but being objective in our viewpoint and getting away from, having any ties to one way of how you are supposed to analyze this, but really look at it from an objective viewpoint and really, tap in with the people to be able to really make sure that what you are understanding is available, not only from your viewpoint, but from the viewpoint of people that you're actually studying. And that's what the levels of social media engagement allow now. But before, you can only do this through overseas travel. For a certain amount of time throughout the 20th century until the 21st century, where we are kind of born and we have the luxury of being able to contact people online, but you still want to kind of, preference and prioritize making that trip back home, and to really get a grasp of the people and really talk to the people in dialogue and really, build your framework based upon the truth of what people are experiencing versus these, distortions that you may be having in your own mind whenever you are taking the concepts of what you may understand to be Africa. Um, so after this third passage, we're going to get into basically that is going to basically give you the full view of what the pledge is of this concept of the Ubuntu magic, the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. And further along, we're going to now get into the turn. And the turn is when you start to see basically the disappearance of, whatever the original pledge was. So we have basically the pledge is being presented of, okay, yes, you are an African American. Yes, you started, in some level of slavery is what they're trying to say. And in this slavery, you came from a place, but, forget about that place. You have to now be an American, work in America, and basically adopt the American principles, assimilate to American culture. And this is where kind of like the turn happens to where you stop wanting to associate with your African self. And that is the magic that is happening. Like they're giving you an amnesia of Africa because now you're not in a place where you can have a constant reminder of what you truly are. You're now adopting the American, the ways of living and just the understanding, and it's kind of just disassociating you more and more. And as we further along in our article, we kind of get into the aspect of fully diving into this with the turn. So we're going to go fully into the turn on our next episode, which will be on Wednesday at 8:30. But I'm just going to give you a preview of what we will be getting into as we continue this journey. So, in terms of what we are going to get this information from, again, in terms of how we are gathering this information is through the dialogue that I'm having with my audience on Instagram and on TikTok, on Facebook, and they're able to feed me information through the comment sections of my reels that's posing questions about, the connections between African Americans and the so-called Bantu people and Nguni speaking people of Southern Africa. And, from the information that I was able to gather, they have some people that believe that Africans originated, they have some, Columbus basically African exchange with America as well. And this is other aspects that we are able to kind of break down how the perception is changing based upon these different pathways that people don't really understand which is the right one. So people are basically exploring different avenues to where some people in America may have some belief